This is Adrienne Alvord. She serves on the board of directors of the Sierra Fund. Yay! I first met Adrienne when she showed up at the offices of California Rural Legal Assistance, where I worked for more than 20 years ago, and I have followed her work ever since as a friend and an admirer. Adrienne Alvord is the Union of Concerned Scientists California and Western States Director. Prior to coming to the union, she was the Environmental Policy Director for California State Senator Fran Pavley and served as lead staff on AB 32, that climate change bill, which you might have heard of. Adrienne was the one chained to the desk writing that thing. She worked extensively in climate, energy, fuels, waste, and agricultural policy, and has deep experience both in translating science and technical work into policy ideas and creating strategic partnerships to achieve those policies. She's been part of some of the most significant policy changes in the state, including quite recently the State Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, about which Lori Mott was just speaking. Adrienne will discuss climate change and the intersection of science and policy. Welcome.
Thank you, Izzy.
All right.
Okay, well, despite working for a science organization, I'm not the most technologically savvy, but I think I can press the button and make this work. I'm very proud to be here and to be a supporter and board member for the Sierra Fund. For my money, it is pound for pound the most effective organization I know. And I'm very pleased to see all of you coming together to talk about preserving the Sierras and then especially our precious headwaters. I'm going to start this off to cover a few things that are actually pretty challenging, but need to be faced. I'm going to talk about what science tells us today about climate change and where we are. Then I'm going to briefly discuss what we're seeing in terms of climate change in California, including in the Sierra Nevada, with particular emphasis on the water system. And then I'm going to do a short overview of what we're doing about it at the state and the federal level. It's a very dynamic environment right now. And I'll end with a request for you to think about your role and the role of Sierra communities and how we can help highlight the need for accelerated action on climate change. I want to, of course, do a quick word about my organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS. We put rigorous independent science to work to solve our planet's most pressing problems, using science, technical analysis, and effective advocacy to create solutions for a safe and sustainable future. We've been in California this year for 25 years, very happy about that, and our offices are in downtown Oakland. Most of our work focuses on climate change, clean energy, and clean transportation. To learn more about UCS's work, please go to www.ucsusa.org. Now to climate change. I'm not crazy about this slide, although it does a good job of summarizing climate impacts. It's quite cheery looking, but it actually tells a pretty sobering story about climate impacts. But what I think is more sobering and more to the point is that every single one of these impacts, from stronger storms to changes in precipitation to changing ocean chemistry and sea level rise to more extreme drought and wildfires, we're experiencing all of this throughout the world right now, and it's only going to get worse. And all of these changes we are seeing, except for melting or for thawing permafrost, we're seeing here in California right now. I do want to say, too, I know this is a scientist-rich environment, and I think a lot of what I have to say here will be kind of basic for some of you who already know the science, and sorry about that, but hopefully you'll learn a thing or two about policy, so hang on. This, I hope, is the most depressing thing you'll see all day and maybe ever. This is actually where we are. After the Paris Accord, which I think you all know about, where 175 nations came together to pledge to reduce their climate emissions and to move toward the goal of not allowing warming to go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, that was the goal, I got some questions about, well, why is it now 1.5? In the previous international accords, it was 2 degrees. What happened? Did the science change? Well, I think this does a pretty good job of explaining why we need to be more aggressive. If you look at the arrow on the right and you take a look at some of the things that scientists predict may happen as the temperatures rise, I think if you look at the bottom, that's really the most frightening thing to me. We have about 30 years to seriously bend the curve downward to get where we need to go. That's not a reason for despair, but it is a reason for us to be very, very serious about this. Without any global action, temperatures are predicted to rise between 4.1 and 4.8 degrees centigrade. With the pledges that were made for the Paris Accord, the international pledges, we will probably get to between 3.3 and 3.6 degrees, which, as you see here, isn't really a very good place. So we really do have to go further. So I think what I would say here, it says adaptation highly questionable. I think what that means is that the planet will be a very, very difficult place to live at a temperature increase of 3.3 to 3.6 degrees. Billions of people will probably be displaced because of sea level rise and other problems, and some places will just become uninhabitable. There are some real questions about, say, Phoenix, Arizona, about whether that will ever be a place we can live. But I want you to remember that 10 years ago when we were debating AB 32, most of the conventional wisdom was that we could not possibly get to the kind of low carbon energy unless we had a massive nuclear energy program that would get us anywhere near what we needed to do. 10 years later, we have a 50% renewable portfolio standard goal here in California, which was kind of unthinkable 10 years ago. The RPS could probably be achieved by 2025 if we really put our minds to it. And we're now contemplating a 100% renewable energy standard by the year 2045. There's a legislation right now to see about that. So serious and important changes that can really decarbonize the economy can happen relatively quickly if we take them seriously and put our minds to it. So California has a well-deserved reputation as a climate policy leader, but we still face daunting problems thanks to climate change that will underlie and impact all the issues you'll be discussing at this conference. This NOAA satellite slide comparing 2 years of recent snowpack during the drought is a pretty clear graphic of the threat to our surface water supply. More than 60% of our developed surface water originates in the Sierra. So when that snowpack is substantially below average, as it was between 2012 and 2016, our period of extreme drought, we have enough storage to get us through a couple of years, but then it really gets to be very serious business, and we're forced to utilize our already, in some areas, very critically overdrafted aquifers. The situation is really not sustainable. In the Sierra Nevada region, there's been greater observed warming than the rest of the state, particularly at the lower elevations of the Sierra, which just happens to be where a huge amount of our water is stored. Warming is contributing to more frequent wildfires. We used to have a fire season. It is now year-round. We have more intense and larger fires with losses of vegetation. We actually release more CO2 from trees and soils. Fire itself is a contributor to climate change. I believe in the King Fire of 2014 that burned about 97,000 acres, and the Rim Fire, which burned over 250,000. I was told that the emissions were equivalent to 3.1 million cars driving for a year. So high-intensity wildfires can also denude a landscape dramatically, increase runoff and sediment, and that degrades water quality, it damages infrastructure, and it reduces our storage capacity for water. And after the 5-year drought we just come through, there's been extensive damage to the Sierra forests. The number that people are quoting is 102 million dead trees, many in the southern Sierra, killed by drought and also by insect infestations, bark beetle, which have become more deadly because of the stresses on trees because of drought and heat. This is a ponderosa pine forest that came from the U.S. Forest Service, courtesy of Circle of Blue. Sorry, so you can't see that very well, can you? Well, climate change has already started to cause a number of problems for our watershed and our highly engineered water system of dams and canals that we depend on for surface water. In addition to the changes in snowpack, we're seeing, of course, more intense droughts and flooding, decreased hydropower reliability, stress on many plant and animal species from warmer air and water temperatures, degraded water quality when stream flows are lowered, increased salinity in the delta, challenges for recreation and fishing, and stresses on our existing infrastructure. Higher precipitation and changes have already had a significant impact on the amount of our water resources and when we can get it. The average early spring snowpack in the Sierra has decreased by about 10% during the last century, and that represents a loss of about 1.5 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot is about enough water to supply a family of 4 for a pretty efficient family of 4 for a year. So it's a pretty significant loss of water. And in addition, an important factor that a lot of people don't pay attention to is that the timing of the snowmelt is shifting. It's as many as 30 days earlier than it was in the mid-20th century. So that reduces summer water flows in many snow-fed rivers. So this means that water is less available in the summer months when demand is highest. So a case in point of the kind of extremes we're seeing, of course, is the near failure of the Oroville Dam. In February, this was Oroville in October of 2015. The lake was at about 48% of average volume and 29% below capacity. This was last February. It was a year and 4 months from the previous photograph. The lake was threatening to overtop the dam. It's too early to say entirely what were the factors that led to the spillway failures, but it appears that at least one major factor was the dam operators apparently did not think the lake could fill as fast as it did. And that happened in part both because of faster runoff than expected due to both rain and snow, and something we're likely to get a lot more of, rain on snow. We don't know if this is an unprecedented event in terms of the flows because the data hasn't been released yet, but we know that the lake was filling rapidly because of an extremely wet event, which we're likely to see more of, and we know that the auxiliary spillway, which was essentially a hillside, was never expected to be used. So in sum, we're seeing more extreme events at both ends of the spectrum, dry and wet, and our current system is just not engineered to handle it. So there's a lot more we need to do, especially in terms of how we approach our infrastructure design to factor for climate change, but there's actually a great deal that California is already doing to prepare us for the future and to help mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. We produced several science-based state plans, starting in about 2000, to identify impacts and also start to create policy recommendations to deal with them. And our last 3 governors, most prolifically Governor Brown, have issued a lot of executive orders to deal with various aspects of adaptation, including Governor Brown's order to include climate change in all state agency planning. California also boasts over 10 years of pioneering action on climate mitigation. As we've discussed, in 2006, we passed the first economy-wide climate change legislation, AB 32, requiring the states to lower emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, which they said would stop the economy. And actually what happened was we went from the 8th largest economy in the world to the 6th. So whatever was happening with climate mitigation, it wasn't stopping our economy. Last year, we passed SB 32, which sets the stage for starting to truly decarbonize the economy, requiring emissions reductions of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And in case you think we're all by ourselves, other states may be on the verge of taking similar action, including Oregon and Washington, who are both contemplating ambitious economy-wide emissions reduction measures and pricing measures that may be passed by 2018, we hope. Under the umbrella of our climate mitigation goals, California has become a sort of factory for carbon reduction policies and incentives, and you see a sampling of them here, from aggressive renewable energy standards to electric vehicles, to building energy efficiency, to incentives for low-income communities, to much, much more. In 2006, there were predictions that our 2020 goals would result in economic collapse. Clearly, there have been a lot of opportunities that have come from this, and there's still much to do, but we have made a very impressive start. But lest we get too big-headed about our achievements, California is not alone. We now have 19 other states in the District of Columbia. They have climate targets that are perhaps not as rigorous as ours, but they are still intentions to reduce emissions pretty substantially. And we also have 29 states that have renewable energy standards, essentially zero carbon energy. And we were not the first there. The state of Iowa actually beat us to being the first state. And we are also not the most stringent. Hawaii takes that honor. But then there's the federal government. While cities and states are making progress, particularly in decarbonizing energy, the federal government has been slower to respond, although there's been some real progress in recent years. In 2007, the Massachusetts versus EPA case at the federal Supreme Court, which was decided by a 5-4 vote, they ruled that the federal EPA can regulate climate emissions under the Clean Air Act. And this was the basis for both President Obama's Clean Car Rules and the Clean Power Plan, which were bold executive orders to reduce emissions from vehicles and power plants. And we, along with about 175 other nations, of course, have signed the Paris Accord with the goal of keeping warming to about 1.5 degrees. It's important as we're moving forward that up to now, none of those things have changed. But other things have changed a lot. The new president is kind of confusing on this subject. He said that he believes that climate change is a Chinese hoax. You see his rather infamous tweet from 2012. 3 years, however, before he tweeted this, he actually signed a statement urging immediate climate action. That was a business leader letter. He and his family signed on to that. And since then, he's been kind of unclear. But his appointee down here on the bottom left, Scott Pruitt, who heads the EPA, has been very clear. He doesn't agree that human activity causes climate change. We need more study. That actually contradicts the EPA's own science. And if you see an administration budget as a reflection of priorities, you see Defense Department gets the biggest rise, EPA is cut by almost a third. That includes not just climate change programs and critical science, but a lot of watershed protection programs at the state and regional level. Excuse me. So there's a lot of uncertainty. If federal action stalls, it's not clear what will happen. I think it's fair to say we're at a pivotal moment, given the short time we have to take action, but there are some things that we can do, and they're important. The good news is that our state policies really can't be undone by the federal government, or at least not very easily. We have our SB 32, our RPS, our low carbon fuel standards, our many other policies that are not likely to be subject to federal inventions or rollbacks. And it's surprising to some people that even when there are threats, a lot of the opposition to rolling things back comes from unexpected quarters. For example, there was talk that there would be attempts to preempt or challenge state renewable energy policies, but it's become clear that Republican governors in places like Ohio and Florida would fight that. So that's not likely to occur. But the bad news is the federal government is on the verge, at least the stated intention is to cut back an enormous amount of funding on basic science and energy research, which we really, really need to continue to understand how the climate works, how to deal with a warming planet, and also to create new and better technologies to reduce emissions. I think you all know that the challenge to science is much bigger than climate change. We are facing a cultural and financial challenge to core principles of public interest science. This is why we're seeing so many scientists, maybe some of you, who are not a group of people known for taking action politically, who are taking to the streets. And we had 400 marches for science around the world, including 40 here in California on Earth Day. Many thousands of people. I've not seen a total, but from where I was sitting, it was a heck of a lot. But you don't have to be a scientist to have a voice in the climate conversation. This point really bugs us, any more than you have to be a doctor to have a legitimate viewpoint on smoking, or an engineer to decide whether or not you want to see an infrastructure project built. And those of you from the Central Valley and the Sierras actually have a bit of an advantage right now at the federal level over folks like me who vote in the Bay Area. Your political voice is helped because many of you actually vote in swing or Republican districts. So you're more likely to have sway in Washington because of the current political configuration. So if you're concerned about this issue, I urge you to let your voice be heard at the ballot box and in the halls of the Capitol and the people who are supposed to be representing you. We are fortunate in California that we have an increasing number of Republicans who've said that they take the climate threat seriously and or have voted for measures that would address climate change in some fashion, such as the Assembly Minority Leader, Chad Mayes, in the center, who has recently come out and said that he thinks that we need to take action. Also, two members who represent the Sierra Nevada communities, Brian Dahle on the left and Tom Berryhill on the right, have voted for measures that are about addressing climate change. We also, of course, have ambitious Democratic leadership from Assemblymember Rendon, Governor Jerry Brown, and Senate Pro Tem Kevin De Leon. I won't gloss over the fact that there are big differences in philosophy generally between the two parties, but at least we're having a conversation about how to solve a problem rather than a time-wasting conversation about whether or not a problem exists. So Dr. Seuss's Lorax is having a big resurgence at the moment because unless we care a whole awful lot, it's not going to get better. It's not. So if you care about this issue and would like to help make a difference and are not currently engaged, there are three things I would urge you to do. I think the first one I've already said, engage with your elected leaders and let them know you are a climate change voter. Second, let your life reflect your values in your choices, your actions, and in your purchases. There is a lot of guidance for decarbonizing your lifestyle out there, and you can contact many fine organizations, including mine, UCS, and others to learn how to do this. And this is important for two reasons. One, of course, it helps create markets for the kinds of low-carbon products and services that we need. But the other thing is that you are modeling behavior, and we know from vast experience that when people start to do things, other people will follow. So being a role model would be great. The third thing I think is probably the most difficult for most people. You really need to start talking about this with family and friends, at community meetings, religious gatherings, wherever a group of people who care about their children and the welfare of the planet gather, it's an appropriate topic. Silence and confusion are holding us back, and we need to have the courage to speak up. As Californians, we all have a tremendous legacy to preserve, and I hope we'll work together to preserve as much of our wonderful natural legacy as we can for future generations and for ourselves. We have much to do. It will be very hard, and we can do this. Thank you.